Bem-vindos ao podcast Caos Planejado, seu programa sobre cidades. Eu sou Antony Ling e neste episódio tive a honra e a oportunidade de conversar com Alain Bertaud, que é, para mim, o maior urbanista da atualidade. Alain se formou em arquitetura em 1967 na Escola Superior Nacional de Belas Artes em Paris. Durante a graduação, interrompeu seus estudos para trabalhar com licenciamento em Tlemcen, na Argélia, assim como na nova cidade projetada por Le Corbusier de Chandigarh, na Índia. Após sua formatura, mudou-se para Nova York, onde trabalhou brevemente para o arquiteto Johnson e também como urbanista da prefeitura. Sempre acompanhado de sua esposa, Marie-Agnes, também urbanista, mudou-se para o Iêmen, onde trabalhou planejando a rede viária para a expansão urbana. Por quase 20 anos, ele foi um dos principais urbanistas do Banco Mundial, onde aconselhou governos locais e nacionais de vários países europeus, Índia, México, Rússia, África do Sul e China, onde teve a oportunidade de aconselhar o governo na abertura econômica durante o governo de Deng Xiaoping. Atualmente, Alain é um Senior Fellow no Maron Institute of Urban Management, na Universidade de Nova York. Ele também é autor do livro Order Without Design: How Markets Shape Cities, ainda sem tradução para o português. Esta é a segunda entrevista sendo conduzida em inglês aqui no Caos Planejado, mas publicaremos a transcrição traduzida no nosso site. Também estão presentes durante a gravação apoiadores do Caos Planejado, que terão a oportunidade de fazer perguntas ao final da nossa conversa. Para apoiar o Caos Planejado, acesse caosplanejado.com/apoie. Esse episódio é oferecido pela Tlemcen, que promove a economia circular através de ações reais de sustentabilidade, como gestão de resíduos, projetos de logística reversa e transformação de materiais em produtos novos e reciclados. A Tlemcen atua em todo o Brasil com clientes como Havaianas, P&G, Movida e Parque Ibirapuera. Acesse o site tlemcen.com.br e saiba mais. Alain, I believe you studied architecture in the 1960s. In the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. At the time, maybe Le Corbusier was in his 70s. The Athens Charter, maybe the birth of modern urban planning is from 1933. So how was modernist urban planning and Le Corbusier seen in Paris, in urban academia, at the time that you were studying?
Well, he was, he became, let's say in the 60s, he became part of the establishment, really, being a dissenter in the 20s and the 30s, he was attacking the establishment, in particular, they called the Beaux-Arts. And in the 60s, he was literally a god. I mean, he was a guru. Everybody was admiring him, going to his conference. To the point that, in 1963, the study of architecture at the time were very long. It was 8 years after admission. So extremely long with no intermediary degree, by the way. And so in 63, I get a little bored by my study at the Beaux-Arts, and I decided to take a year off, 9 months off. And I went to Chandigarh to work there because Chandigarh at the time were being built, and it was considered to be the best type of planning. So it was a little before Brasilia, in a way, because Chandigarh started earlier. And so I went there, by the way, by hitchhiking, from Marseille, which could not be done now, but, crossing Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and arriving in Chandigarh. And so I worked there with the cousin of Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret, were there, and suddenly living in Chandigarh, if I had been a tourist, probably I would have been convinced that this was a fantastic city. But I was living there. I have colleagues. I had to go to the office every morning, and suddenly I realized how all this concept of the self-contained sectors with the commercial area in the center and all these things didn't work really, and some also not only planning but the architectural thing, to have what they call brise soleil, to cut the sun with slab of concrete, which in fact become like radiators. And also the dust before the monsoon accumulate on this slab of concrete, and then the wind blow them up inside the room. Everything was wrong. When with my colleague we wanted to go to a restaurant, have a drink, or even buy some clothes or something, we will go to a slum area. The people who were building Chandigarh has built a slum because they could not afford to live in Chandigarh. So for me, this was an awakening. That's all this theory that when I read Corbusier, I admired. I think this is completely rational. This is, at the time, the utopia was functional. Something has to be functional. The shape should follow the function, and we should not have ornament or anything. The function itself is the thing. So that was a utopia, and I realized that it doesn't work. That if you cannot plan a say commercial area and decide what type of shop will be there and where they will be. They happen when in a way the people who open a bakery or a restaurant have more information than the planners, so they know where to put it, and that's why they happen in the slum. Because then it's not only that it's cheaper; it's because there is a freedom of location. So that was my big thing, but. And I attended two of Corbusier lecture there, and I found him extremely bitter and negative. By the way, he was a very difficult man. So that was atmosphere at the time, and there was also this thing that if you believe that everything has to be rational, of course you have your own rationality from where you are as a Frenchman of the 20th century, and you think that rationality, of course, is universal, and you should impose it on others who are not. So that's why it came then a bit later was Philip Johnson or Miss Van der Rohe, the international style, which that again is rationality. So it's universal. There should not be, type of architectural planning which is specific to Brazil or China or India. It's because rationality. It's like mathematics, for instance. We are all using the same mathematics. And so the idea that planning will be like mathematics.
Yeah. And Alain, you mentioned back then Le Corbusier, at least when he was beginning, he was, let's say, challenging the mainstream. And what was the mainstream before, and how were these ideas seen in Paris? For example, Solly Angel mentions about, let's say, classic urban planning, right?
Right.
Commissioner's plan in New York, Cerdà's Barcelona expansion, even Haussmann's renovation in Paris. How are these ideas perceived when you were a student, and what were your thoughts back then?
We thought they were obsolete, and it's all, in a way, it's a bit complex because on one hand, we were living in Paris and we admire Paris. When you walk through Paris, there's so many things which are interesting. And at the same time, when Corbusier say we want to destroy the street, the street should disappear, the idea was so radical that it was attractive, although it's a complete nonsense, of course. And especially when you live in Paris, where the streets are, because of the lack of zoning, you have a bakery, a hairdresser, but also an art gallery, completely mixed up, and that's what makes the attraction of Paris, this variety. And so strange, it was, I think, I think that people enjoy this anti-establishment, a revolutionary, that's the kind of thing. And I think that the attraction was that the establishment was still rather powerful, including at the École des Beaux-Arts, but they were paying lip service to Corbusier because those ideas were very popular among the young. So they will pay some lip service, but continue basically, I would say, not classical, but kind of an outcome of Art Deco, but in planning, pretty much the continuation of the idea of Haussmann or Cerdà. Cerdà is more kind of so there was this antinomy. And of course, the idea of Corbusier never except Chandigarh and his possible influence in Brasilia, had never built in a city or he didn't have any success in urban planning really. Except in public housing. The government embraced the idea of Corbusier for public housing precisely because the people who live there were not the client. The client when you build a new city are the civil servants who are giving you a contract. It is not the people who are going to live in the city. So there is no feedback.
And I noticed, having been to Paris, that Parisian suburbs with public housing and the expansion of Paris metro area is radically different from Paris and has probably has a lot of inspiration in Le Corbusier.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because the government intervened. I don't think that there is a private sector, let's say, response to Corbusier. It's always public because in a way, Corbusier was asking for norms to be, uniformity and norms. And that is very attractive for civil servants. When they pass contract, if you have norms, this is simple, to administer. And life is not simple.
And what about Haussmann in Paris? Maybe today, is there a consensus view about what was done in Paris? And what are your views? I've seen you talking about maybe what he did. Paris could not survive without it, maybe. But.
Yes, right, yeah. In a large city, you need mobility. And before Haussmann, it's true that Paris was still a medieval city in a large area. You can... to have a real idea, I mean, there were very few sociological studies, but if you read the novels of Balzac, Balzac described housing, and Balzac wrote in the 1830s, so, about 20, 30 years before Haussmann. And he described a lot of neighborhood or people living in some neighborhood. And you see that they were really slum, in the same sense as the slum of London described by Dickens. But the problem was not housing. The problem was really moving around the city. And I think Haussmann solved that in a way. But what was interesting, if you compare Haussmann to, say, Robert Moses, for instance, in New York, the advantage of Haussmann was a real estate operation. It was not an infrastructure operation. He didn't dig boulevard just to move, like you will move a highway. It was entirely financed by selling land on both sides of the boulevard to the private sector. So it was borrowing money from the private sector in real estate. And that, I think, is a big difference with Brasilia, for instance. Brasilia was not financed by the real estate; it was financed by the Brazilian taxpayer. Not where Paris Haussmann was financed by people who bought land on both sides of the new boulevard. So this had to have value, that people will recognize, and that's a big difference between this and public housing built by government in the suburbs. So I think that. The charm of Paris, in a way, is that along those boulevards, what was built was entirely demand-driven. Although the boulevard themselves were top-down, obviously, the tracé. But what was built on both sides of the boulevard was demand-driven.
Right. And so you mentioned Moses, and maybe we can move on to your period in New York, actually.
Yes.
So you say you arrived in 1968.
68, yes. January 68, yes.
I believe that was the year Jane Jacobs left New York to move
That's
to
exactly
Toronto.
it. Yeah, right. Yeah. She was she had a trial for rioting or something, and she had, I think, to pay a fine or something. And then she moved to Canada then that year. But at the time, her fight was very much in the news in New York. There was a newspaper which has disappeared now, which was called the Village Voice. But that's every liberal, everybody in university or even educated people who read, on top of the New York Times, the Village Voice, and there were a number of journalists and also writers who write in the Village Voice. So the Village Voice were really the voice of Jane Jacobs at the time, yes, and their continuation. Her
works, Death and Life of Great American Cities, is from 1961. The Economy of Cities is from 1969.
Yes.
So she was writing in the Village Voice. Was she already an influence within urban planning circles? Did you read her books at the time?
No, because they were not published yet. I read them 4 or 5 years later. I think she wrote her book when she moved to Canada, if I remember well. I don't remember it, but I read about her, and it was more anti-Moses than pro-Jacobs in a way. The theory of Jane Jacobs, I think most people became familiar with them about 10 years later. The idea, of course, anybody who lived in the village or was close to the village, Greenwich Village, and the idea that a highway will cross over Washington Park in a way, this was not a real estate operation, you see, like Haussmann. It was an infrastructure operation, to move cars, to move trucks or cars from, let's say from New Jersey to Long Island, basically. That was the idea. So, and the idea that a highway like that, I think, could be justified if it was underground, because it will give value to a lot, on both sides, for instance. But say, if you just cut the highway in an existing urban fabric, you will have a decrease in value of real estate. You cut Manhattan into two, and probably within a kilometer, north and south of the highway, you will have a semi-dead urban fabric, because all the streets will be dead ends in the middle of Manhattan. Where in fact Manhattan is a continuity. There's not even. There are some centers like Greenwich Village or Midtown or Wall Street, but those are linked by a continuity. There's not. They are not self-sufficient. It's a vectors. Which goes from Wall Street to Harlem. And if you cut a thing, it's like cutting a limb. You could some part will become dead. So the real cost of such a highway, if it was justified in terms of mobility, would be enormous, because you had this devaluation of real estate on both sides. My estimate would be about a kilometer on both sides, which will lose complete value. And Manhattan in itself, being cut in two, will also lose value. You'll have a fragmentation also of the labor market there, because of the difficulty of moving back and forth.
Yeah, we've seen in many large Brazilian cities these urban expressways having exactly this effect.
Yes.
And there are some discussions today on maybe tearing down some of them. So this is very close to our reality.
To my dismay, I found also that sometimes the BRT, the bus rapid transit, has the same effect. I found that in Curitiba, in some part of Curitiba, but even more in Bogota. If you look at let's say the real estate on both sides of the Transmilenio in Bogota, you see that it's always very low value, like it's equivalent of having a highway. Mm-hmm. And it could be maybe solved by some design, urban design thing, which allow more, that's possible. But as it is, I think it is a bit nearly a Robert Moses operation. Although it, a BRT, of course, branch on people all around. So it has a positive side, obviously. But it moves a lot of people and at a cheap price. But the real estate issue is not solved in the BRT, including in Curitiba. Some part of Curitiba.
Yes, many of the BRTs we have here are indeed very wide. And to cross it, they build pedestrian walkways that are not very friendly.
Right, yeah. So that could be solved, I suppose, with urban design. In my book, I don't treat urban design. The book is long enough like that. But I think it's an important part, a complementary part. Again, a park like Washington Square is very effective, although it's relatively small. It's 4 hectares. Very, very effective because it's a good design. But there are parks which are larger, which are not very effective because they are not very accessible and nobody go there. So design is really a very, very important part of planning and land use in general.
Definitely. So Alain, going back to New York and Jane Jacobs, right? So you mentioned your perceptions today about what was the effect of these expressways going through the city. So back then in the late 1960s, 1970s, were you working at City Hall in New York?
My first job was with Philip Johnson, the architect Philip Johnson, and it was an incredible experience because it was in the Seagram building, which built by Miss Van der Rohe. It's one of the best skyscraper in New York, certainly in terms of design. And coming from Paris, where, I've never been in a building which was higher than 8th floor, there were no skyscraper in France at the time. And also the architects in France at the time were, wanted to give an image of being bohemian, although they were businessmen like everybody else. But they dressed like Che Guevara, things like that. And suddenly I end up with Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was always dressed in the best Italian suit, and inside the office you had a thing. There was a Giacometti sculpture at the entrance. There was a Picasso tapestry and a Miro tapestry also at the entrance. It was an incredibly different, but I quickly found it very boring, although it looked very good on my resume as an architect, because there was again this guru thing. It was exactly the same thing as for Corbusier. People worship Philip Johnson, and I think he was an interesting guy. He was very witty, but I don't think he had a clue about anything, frankly. So it was very frustrating in a way to work there. So after about 5 or 6 months, I think, I found I start meeting people, and thanks, by the way, to the American culture, which is much, we were, as foreigner, we didn't know anybody, but we were very quickly invited by all sorts of people. And so you establish a network. We had, I think, a larger network of France in New York after 6 months than we had in Paris after 5 years. And so I found a job then in the city planning department. It was a time of Mayor Lindsay, and it was a time of the Black Panther, Black Power, and I think they were. I guess they never told me that, but I guess I was hired because of my French accent. They were desperate to dialogue with the Black community, but there was such a, let's say, antinomy. There was such a lack of confidence between, let's say, the white establishment and the Black community, that they found that I was a nice intermediary, in the sense that nobody in Harlem, well, they was not completely sure I was white, and they could not identify me in a box because of my accent. So it was much easier for me to relate there. So after some time, first I worked in next to City Hall at the planning department in downtown, and then after that we moved an office in Harlem, and then I stayed in Harlem. Only, by the way, trying to sell to the community a completely absurd project. Again, the idea, it was a project designed by MIT professors. The idea was to continue, the Park Avenue into Harlem, and by building a vault over the railway, which is under Park Avenue, and then moving poor people into this new building on both sides of Park Avenue. The idea at the time was very common all over the world. Well, that's if you build very nice houses for poor people, then the problem is solved. You eradicate poverty by just building nice housing for them. And the idea, and at the time, Harlem had a lot of problem, crime and drug addiction was incredible. Basically, the building on both sides of Park Avenue, on Lexington and Madison, many of the buildings were abandoned and were just used by junkies as a heroin alley or things like that, or the drug alley. So it's not building new housing there will not solve this problem of crime. And actually, it would have been made worse, because to communicate between the two parts of Harlem, East Harlem and West Harlem, you will have to go under this vault, which was even much larger, wider. So you will have a little tunnel. And, tunnels are not very good in area which were full of crimes and drug addicts.
Alain, I think by this time, Robert Moses was already stepping out of City Hall. But
yes,
from your...
Well, he was never in City Hall. He was never elected. But he was a very powerful, I think the word of Robert Caro, the power broker. That's exactly what he was, without being elected, because he had so many connections with the building industry, the highway industry, and politicians. That's well, everything he did were not negative. The Palisade, for instance, or the Jones Beach, thing like that, were valid things, except that the highway to go to Jones Beach had very low bridges to prevent buses from using it, because he didn't want the rabble of the city to mess up the beaches.
So back then, you mentioned you were at City Hall, and some of these projects were still, let's say, we could see them today as a little bit absurd.
Yes.
And you mentioned that when you were at Chandigarh, you already had let's say, a first awakening.
Yes.
So what were your thoughts at the time? How were your views on urban planning evolving, and how did you see the way that they were planning Manhattan at the time?
It was a bit a continuation from Chandigarh in a way. When I first worked on this project in Harlem, building this vault and using the air right to build, there was still my background as architect. An architect liked to build things, and especially new things, which look different. So first I thought, hey, this is great. This is a big project. I can. And then again, when you live in Harlem and you realize that, going, for instance, under the existing railway, which crossed Harlem, was a dangerous place and people urinated there. And you say, my project is going to triple the width of this tunnel. And then you realize, gee, I would not like to cross this, I have to take the subway in Lexington. So I will have to go from my office and go in there. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you realize that, that's what looks, as an architect, was look like a great thing, which will make it into a magazine, is a terrible thing when you are on the ground. And that was a continuity. So I started doing things, especially when I was still downtown. During my lunch break, I will go to a certain place in the Wall Street area, and I will try to count how people were on foot move around the city. When you get out of a subway and you have to go to your office, you have an alternative of several routes. Why would you take one route rather than another? So I start following people and noting on a map what they were doing, and I noted that sometimes they didn't take the shorter route, and they went into the most attractive route, let's say more diverse, where there were more shops, things like that, even if they didn't use the shop. So for me, this pedestrian view of urban was very important, and I could see that this was something which normally completely neglected by planners. Mm-hmm. This street view of for instance, say Philip Johnson built a library for NYU at Greenwich Village, and Greenwich Village is interesting because there are so many shops and restaurants, and the library is completely, it's a blank wall of red, very beautiful red limestone, but it's kind of sunlight. It become boring, and so I'm not saying that in the library you should necessarily have opening for a coffee shop or something. Maybe you should. The contact between the private space of a block and the street should be as transparent as possible. It should not be a fortress. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what's interesting. And in a way, you mentioned that, I was critical of some of what my colleagues were doing, and including, by the way, Marie-Agnes at the time. We were working also at City Hall, but she was working on giving incentive to make plaza like the Seagram building. I talk about it in my book, that indeed the plaza of the Seagram building is a success, urban design success. It's wonderful. But you cannot regulate good design. As soon as you regulate it, you kill the design. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, on 6th Avenue, the idea that all the new skyscraper there will be like the Seagram building with a plaza. So if all the building have a plaza, there is no plaza. It's just a wider avenue. And then the lawyer take over because the plaza will be private space. That means that if anybody break his leg there or do anything, the building is responsible for it, not the city, so they can be sued. So the lawyer convinced the architect to make this plaza as hostile as possible, so there will be the least people possible. So you see, but there is a logic to it. You know, it's not just a conspiracy or bad will. There is a logic to it, and you have to understand this logic. Why things do not succeed just through regulation.
Perfect. Yeah, the example is of the plaza is excellent. So fast forward maybe 10, 15 years, Jane Jacobs' books have come out.
Yes.
Her work around some emergent order in cities is maybe one of the first to be written in that kind of writing. And to me, it resonates a lot with the work that you have published recently in a different way. Has her work did her work influence you at the time?
Yes.
And how did you
relatively
see it?
later, you know, after New York, we went to Yemen where we spent 3 years. So in Yemen, Jane Jacobs books were not accessible, although they were published at the time we were there, but we have no access to them. And after Yemen, so Yemen, you know, in a way, what Jane Jacobs talk about, I had observed those things, you know, again in Chandigarh, that the slum were more alive, you know, that more diversity than the planned city and things like that. But I didn't have a theory behind it. I say, in a way, it was a little anecdotal. In Yemen, I observe also that the density, you know, at the time, Sana'a, I mean, the Yemeni cities were completely unplanned, you know, in the sense that people were just aggregating things. And my main job in Yemen was really to trace new streets because the city was growing so fast and there was no system really. So I was trying, and so I observed a lot of things like for instance, density decrease when you go away from the city. For me, those were just personal observation, idiosyncrasies of cities. And it's only when I went to Haiti and I worked with an urban economist, I realized that all these things that I had observed were in fact urban economists that made the theory, you know, they have also observed them, but measured them and made a theory of them. So it confirmed, you know, it gave a theoretical background to things that I had observed and felt positive. So, and it was the same thing for Jane Jacobs. In particular, her book, The Economy of Cities, I think it's in this book where she talked also about, the Turkish city built around obsidian, you know, become an obsidian center. And so the jobs accumulate. And then when obsidian is not more needed, then the city disappears. You know, so again, that confirmed my view of the labor market, you know, a city based on the labor market. So if you don't diversify, if, you start with obsidian, but if you do not diversify and the city is not particularly well located, except for obsidian, then the city will disappear. And I think that was very, so it was, if you want I acquired slowly, I would say, I won't call it academic knowledge, but say theoretical knowledge by other people while observing very carefully what was going on the ground. And then I found a convergence with it, you know, and a complete divergence, of course, with the idea of the international style, you know, and or even ideas like at the time, the big planners were, you know, there was a Greek firm called Doxiadis who built Islamabad, who built a lot of cities. I don't know if they did anything in Latin America. I forgot. Probably they did.
There were a few plans in Brazil.
In Brazil,
I believe in Rio de Janeiro.
Of Doxiadis. And those were these were really Corbusier type of thing in a certain way, you know, a complete rationality built on formula without much, observation of how people live in a city. You know, again, the idea that you have a shopping street in the middle of a neighborhood because it's the closest to all part, like every neighborhood was completely isolated, you know, kind of where a city is a continuity, a street is a continuity. And so, in a way, Christopher Alexander, I think, have a better understanding in theoretical thing than Doxiadis, or again the continuation of this thing of the unit, the plan unit, completely independent and self-sufficient. And the sector of Chandigarh were like that. They were the sectors, and which were 800 meters by, if I remember well, by a kilometer or something like that. And all the commerce were in a little plaza and few streets in the middle of the thing, and where in fact commerce thrive, where people are moving, not, it's not. So it's good to be in the center like that for a primary school, but not good for a commerce.
And so, Alain, looking at this, let's say, timeline of urban utopias and ideas, right? I see, let's say, a change in mindset, maybe beginning with garden cities or modernism, where urban planners started to try to, let's say, organize city form, right?
Yes.
And since then, maybe Jane Jacobs is the first one to give a different perspective on the problem.
Yes.
And but still, after she published her works, many planners tried to use the qualities and ideas she describes in her observations as a sort of design manual, right? So
yes.
Trying to regulate mixed income in the same buildings, or the age of buildings, right? To give the qualities that Jacobs has described by observation and by
yes.
of a spontaneous outcome, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, this is the sad thing about it. Again, it's the same story as the Seagram building. The Seagram building was a good design because it was unique and there. And suddenly, as soon as you start making it in a rule, then it destroys itself. What is important is Jane Jacobs, is spontaneity. At the same time, she didn't speak about spontaneous order exactly, but something like that. And she speaks about randomness, and this is what's so difficult to accept for planners, randomness. That in a way, we get back maybe to the idea of, Hayek or even, Adam Smith, that individual initiative, people have knowledge, again, how to run a bakery or a butcher, for instance, in the case of Adam Smith, that planners do not know where to put how many butcher shops they should be and where they should be. So to make into a rule that suddenly you observe that in Paris you have, say, a butcher for every 10,000 people, and you say, we are going to plan a city where you have a butcher. I say butcher, but it could be anything else, a shopping center or something. Then you get it wrong, because precisely this thing is evolving depending on the way demand evolves. People maybe at the same time eat less meat or get their meat from somewhere else than the butcher, and so the city should be allowed to evolve on that. And so I think that's an important contribution of Jane Jacobs, is precisely that this render. So you should have a structure. After all, the streets of Greenwich Village, if that was a model, were already there and they never change. And she didn't want the street to change. But on these streets, you build things differently depending on the way people evolve and technology evolve. And I think that's a message which is the most important, So you have a spontaneous order, which is made of individuals who are pursuing their own interest, let's say, again, in the Adam Smith theory, and who have special knowledge of their field, like, Hayek postulates. And then you absolutely need a structure of which is top down, like Haussmann, on which you branch that. And the important thing is that the communication between the private and the public, which often very neglected. I reproach very much urban planner now to spend too much time trying to design what is happening in the private sector, and not enough in the area where they are responsible for it, and not enough in the designing the public space, and especially the relationship between the public and the private space. For instance, the opening of shops, or if you have a garage, how it should open so that you have a still maximum of life on the street and things like that. There are some progress. I see now some progress in the design of sidewalk in New York in some area. So that's very good, especially when you have a pedestrian crossing, things like that. I think they have improved it. But I think this is new. This should have been, I think, the main concern of urban planners. I get back also to the question of BRT. I think that BRT suffer from a lack of good urban design to link, the station of BRT with the rest of the city, and the way the city communicates across the BRT line, which are just urban design problems. And I think these have been grossly neglected. But if you look at the New York zoning plan, they go into minute details about the height of building, how far they should be from each other, the size of kitchen, the way the bathroom should be connected to and I'm not talking here, by the way, about safety regulation, fire or sanitation. This I leave it to the customer. Cannot you don't know. You have to rely on the fireman to know what is a fireproof building. You can, but anything which is space use, how much floor space you consume and how it is organized. I think the consumer is the best judge to do that, and the shopkeeper too. In New York, for instance, for many shop there is a minimum and maximum floor space for some reason. I don't know where it comes from. Magic numbers that are coming from.
Yes, exactly. So we've seen. Since then, let's say, and since Jacobs, we've seen a sort of explosion of new utopias, right? From new urbanism, and even transit-oriented development has, let's say, a final view on the shape of how the city should look like, right? And my question is we've seen this since. The Garden City, it's like 120 years already.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And Jane Jacobs came along with these new ideas, but her ideas got lost somehow in the middle of the process. And we're still not, let's say, in the path of going back to, let's say, classical urban planning. And I would like to know your views on why this happens. Sometimes I think, is it the fact that we learn urban planning and architecture as the same thing? Is it something else? Why do you think these ideas have endured for so long?
Yes, I think that it's very, very difficult for architects and engineers. And basically, cities are built by engineers and architects and lawyers. And it's very difficult for them to admit that this spontaneous order, that there are certain things that they may not know, and they should leave the maximum flexibility of land use because they want to optimize everything. And it's easier to, for instance, if you want to optimize transport. I remember a case in Indonesia where the Japanese, JICA, were planning a light rail through Jakarta. And they have very competent, of course, traffic engineers. And they calculated that to make this light rail viable, they needed a density along the light rail of, say, I forgot now, but say 250 people per hectare on a corridor of, say, 1 kilometer on both sides of the light rail. So their idea was not to maximize mobility in Jakarta, was to maximize the viability, the financial viability of their infrastructure. Now, I am not saying that a light rail was not a good idea in Jakarta, but then the objective is a little different. So if the objective is to make the light rail work, not to make it optimum for moving around the city, but to make it work, then of course they need to have this higher density there. And in order to, because there was no demand for this high density yet there, to say the area which are not along the light rail should have a mandatory low density, in order to, which is a bit, by the way, the plan of Curitiba, if in a way it's the same. So you try to maximize the efficiency of infrastructure. You decide on the infrastructure first. Then you say the people around this infrastructure should be grouped that way so that my infrastructure will be very efficient. And this is not the right way to do things. In a way, it's although a transport system is a public sector, but it's the same thing as, when General Motors say, what's good for General Motors is good for the country. It's not necessarily true. So what is good for the light rail, the type of land use which is good for the light rail is not necessarily good for Jakarta. So we had at the same time in Jakarta another example like that, and I think it answers very well your question. Why we had the party. We had that was the World Bank, by the way. We had very competent sewer engineers and drainage engineers, and they look at Jakarta and the soil condition, and they say, in a tropical country like that, we do not need. We could get away without having a traditional sewer system. We could have oxidation ponds, which are local, and seepage pit. But in order to do that, the density will have to be less than 50 people per hectare. So they say the planner should plan a city of less than 50 people per hectare, and then we will save a lot on the sewer. You put it in reverse here. Of course, you should have a sewer which is the least expensive possible, but to serve the people where they are, not to design a city around a sewer system.
No, that's a great example. And the example you mentioned with the light rail in Indonesia, I would say it's basically the dominant idea in Brazil today.
Yes.
So the latest São Paulo master plan is based on this idea. So they allowed higher density, but not that much, FAR of 4 around the main rail and BRT lines, but said, okay, outside these areas, we will want lower density. And within the high density lines, we will incentivize smaller units. So we will have more people occupying these buildings, and we will restrict the amount of parking. So people will also not use the car, and they will use the rail or the bus system.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Again, strangely enough, you see at the end of my short article there on the 15-minute city, I have a quotation of Tocqueville, which, in a way, when you look at the regulation you describe in São Paulo, is people they're really concerned about making things work. And then they establish rules so that the thing they design will work, and without really considering, why people in São Paulo, some of them will have to use cars. They maybe a doctor, maybe a plumber obviously has to use a car. They say, well, it would work so well if everybody walked, or and I think that then they put rules which seems not too tyrannical in a certain way, to say, well, we are going to reduce parking mandate. Again, I think parking should not be compulsory. It's a part of real estate, and it should be operated privately, because in many cities subsidize parking, and in a way, if you like in many cities of the world, you say for a shop of this, you need that many parking lots. You are subsidizing it, because you are obliging people to provide that. So I think it should be a part of real estate. And the same way as you should not decide, how many bakery you have in a city, you should not decide how many parking space, but it should be market driven. That means it should not be subsidized. If there are people where, then you should certainly be very careful about the urban design aspect. All this private parking lot where they will be probably underground, communicate with the city so they don't clog the city or be dangerous for pedestrians or things like that. So that's the aspect which should be regulated, the urban design and the link between the two. But again, to me, the urban design is mostly in the public area, which are not driven by markets, which are not driven by people preferences. You can observe the number of of pedestrians in the street and say, well, we need wider sidewalks, but the market is not going to give you wider sidewalks. There is no mechanism for that, even if there is a high demand. So here it has to be top down in a certain way. And a lot of attention should be given to that, but much less to, let's say, the size of apartment or thing like that, which I think the people can decide by themselves. And certainly there should not be regulation, to say what is the number of apartments of this size or this size. In New York, we have in fact the opposite. We have for each block, we have a number, the maximum number of apartments which can be built in each block, and which is based on a number which was invented in 1962, based on densities at the time where the average household size was around 5 people. Now it's 1.3, I think, in Manhattan or something like that. So it's a completely arbitrary number, just coming out of nowhere, like if it was coming from from the sign of the zodiac or something.
It's amazing. We still have a long way to go, and I think your work is a huge inspiration for us. So, Alain, I think your comment on the 15-minute city gives us a good hint for us to move on to questions of some of our supporters. So yes. Evandro, he sent a question through message. He asks if the argument for the 15-minute city couldn't work, in fact, as a marketing strategy. So maybe not for Paris, where the city has already optimized for 15 minutes where it can, as you argued in your article, but maybe in Brazil or in United States, Parisian suburbs that have not reached this level of accessibility or mixed use. So his question is, maybe this concept would be a good way to summarize a goal for citizens who are not trained as urban planners.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful to have even a 10-minute city, but that will be my problem is not the goal. My problem is the way you achieve it. I think that you achieve, let's say, the 10-minute city, the 15-minute city for, let's say, things like food, schools, or things like that by removing regulation which prevent demand from being met. Do not forget that the 15-minute city depends on densities. If you look at all the plans around the world, the zoning prevents densities. You never have a zoning which all the zoning limit densities, either by floor ratio, by a maximum number of dwelling units per hectare, by setbacks, by all sorts of things. So if you want to increase accessibility, you have to, you have this trade-off that you have to allow density to meet the demand. I'm not saying again that, there is demand for low density too. There are people who enjoy having a backyard and squirrel in their backyard. And so those people are making a trade-off, and they know, if they live in an individual house and they prefer it, they know that their bakery or their grocery store will be at 20 minutes. They can use a bicycle for it if they want. But say that's linked together. You cannot have a 15-minute city without dealing with supply and demand. And so my problem with the planners is that they seem to say, well, we are going to plan it that way. You don't plan it that way. And it's the same for schools. I was, when I read the 15-minute city of Moreno there, I didn't know how schools were built in Paris, frankly. And so I checked in it, and they were very interesting. And it seems that, by the way, they are very competent civil servants because the schools are state-run. And by the way, not the municipality, but the Ministry of Education. We are a central, we're the 14th country. We're very centralized. So, and those civil servants are very, very responsive. And you find more schools in denser neighborhood of Paris and less school in neighborhood where people are aging, that there are much less children. So, and they are very responsive, and they close them and they open them. depending on the change. And that, I think, so I was happily surprised here that they had some good, in a way, they were doing good planning. And so the 15-minute city. Now, if you say, for instance, you should have, especially in a dense city, access to public transport within 15 minutes walk, or I would say even 10 minutes walk. I completely agree with that. That's because, but then you should have a program of that. This is not what Moreno is all about. Moreno say we have a way of redesigning the city so you will find your job within 15 minutes. And I believe that if you move to Sao Paulo or to Paris or Shanghai, it is not to take a job within 15 minutes. You select the best job in the entire metropolitan area of Sao Paulo, and the employer is also looking for selecting the best person in the entire metropolitan. So, you may not. So that this trade-off has to be understood. A job is not an indifferent job. It's not one job. You have a choice. You should have a choice in many jobs.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Alain. So Maria asks a question about urban transformation in urban fringes. So when rural areas are subdivided into lots,
yes,
or maybe vacation homes are transformed into residential areas, excessively and intensively occupying areas that were once low density. So I believe you mentioned some of this in your book about the value of land, but maybe you can comment about this to answer her question.
Yeah, I think that again here you have. Let's say I simplify, we have two cases. Either the state do not intervene at all and you have spontaneous development, but including spontaneous development of streets, and major streets. When it's a small access street to a lot, it doesn't matter. But say, if you have a new suburbs created in the fringe of the city, one of the most important things is that this new suburb have to be linked to the rest of the city. Because again, the people who are moving in this area are part of the labor market, and they are going to have to work somewhere and not necessarily in their neighborhood, probably not in their neighborhood. So the state here has to intervene, and it's a top-down thing to integrate those new neighborhoods with a network of transport which link with the entire area of the city. And this idea that the city could grow with self-contained area. Sometimes you have that in, for instance, I've seen that in Korea, where they build new cities and they think those new cities next to Seoul are going to be self-contained, that people who live there will work there. It's not true. It's never happened that way. So you have to link. The state has to establish a link with the rest of the city. Now, that's done. The way land is subdivided should be, again, entirely demand-driven. Once you have ensured that you have set apart the space which will be not under the market, which will be devoted to main streets, the rest should be demand-driven. And the problem we have, either we have complete failure of the state who do not develop the infrastructure to link those neighborhoods to the rest of the city. And then also, so you have kind of what they call haphazard development, which I don't believe there is nothing really haphazard, but you have all sorts of building, and in a way they respond better to demand because there is no regulation, but then they lack transport. So in the long run, that will not be very good for the city. Or you have then, like the way many American city or European expand, you have an imposition in advance of one pattern, one type of density, and which is arbitrary, which you don't know what will be the demand for, say, 3-story walk-up apartment compared to individual houses or townhouses. And I think that you should have a type of regulation which will allow the consumer to make a choice to live in a suburb but live in a townhouse rather than an individual house, or on the contrary to live on a lot of a quarter of an hectare. And let's see what happens. I don't see why the state should decide on the consumption of land in any area of the city. The infrastructure, engineers will tell you, but the infrastructure is not there. The job of the state is to provide the infrastructure to support where the people are, not the opposite.
With this idea in mind, do you think there is a tension between the necessity of the state to provide infrastructure to all areas and the fact that an individual decision to move into the outskirts of an urban area will, let's say, create a necessity, public necessity, right?
Yeah.
With a higher cost.
I mean, let's say, why will somebody go? The state could say, this is our plan for infrastructure in the future, and we are going to expand. You will not get a road here before 10 years. That's possible. But if somebody, let's say, densify an area which is relatively far away from the border of the urban area, again, you have to ask, why would they do that? In a way, it would be better for them to be closer. That will give more value. So why do they do that? Sometimes they do that because precisely, I've seen that a lot in India, by the way, precisely there are regulations at the fringe which oblige them to use more land than they wanted. And then they have to jump over, or sometimes you have a green belt. And so on the side of the green belt, the land is too expensive because they know it's a green belt. It's the last land left. And in order to have cheaper land, so you have to find why the people do that. The idea that people are vicious and are building things in impossible place just to annoy planners is not true. Again, I'm very often sometime in World Bank report, you see haphazard development, or development which is not under control. I argue with that. Any development which happens has its reason, and you have to find why it is there. And it is to find cheaper land. Why is land so expensive somewhere else? And maybe there are people who are poor, and they settle there precisely because they cannot afford land. So by preventing them from building them, you don't make them richer. So how do these people want to participate in the labor market of the city? Where do they settle? On my book, I gave the example, if I remember well, of in Mexico City of informal development on the slope of a volcano, which probably should not be built. I agree, but say you have to find out why will people build there? Informal settlement, accessible by motorcycle to the labor market of Mexico City. Why would they put that? If you prevent them from building there, and you may have a good reason to do it, I'm not denying it, but then you have to provide an alternative thing. So your reflex should not be to prevent things which you find disturbing, but to say why people move there. Can we provide an alternative at the same price? So you have to monitor the price of this informal settlement and say is it that if they move closer to the city, they have to consume much more land? Then you should have closer to the city the possibility of consuming very little land for these people. So you have to look at the problem that way. In the same way as when people want to close completely the city to cars, you have to look why somebody drives through Manhattan. It's not fun to drive through Manhattan. So why would they drive through Manhattan? And you have to find an alternative. Could some of them be provided with an alternative to that? You see, so again, the idea is that a city is made of people, and you have to find out what is the best for them, rather than design the infrastructure and say the people have to adapt to my infrastructure because really, this will be optimum if they do. Sorry, it was a long answer.
No problem. Do you have time for a couple of more questions?
Yes, I have plenty of time. Yes.
Great. So we have two questions around this concept of infrastructure and informal housing. One of them is how to address urban areas that have been consolidated with, let's say, favelas, and that the urban expansion was unplanned.
Yes.
What is the best benchmarks to bring infrastructure to these areas? And another question by Cristiane is what about areas that maybe are environmentally sensitive areas? We have in Brazil, for example, houses above lakes or rivers. Do we bring infrastructure to these communities, or are these cases where relocation would be justified?
Yes. So the first question, it's possible, so area which are already densified, let's say favelas and surrounding area. I think that one of the main problem here is, again, to link those areas with the rest of the city in terms of, first providing basic infrastructure. I don't think, by the way, especially in a tropical country or a warm country, that housing is as important as infrastructure. So the best thing you can do, in my opinion, in a favela is to bring infrastructure, clean water and also the possibility of moving through the favela relatively fast and to access public transport if it might not be possible within the favela to provide it, but say at the fringe of the favela. I think that's the most important thing. So it is possible that in some area you may have to do a Haussmann operation in order to link, again, this large area. I can think of that in some area of Mexico City where you have a large area, very dense population, and most of the streets are about 6 or 8 meters, no more than 6 meters. Those people are penalized by lack of access of the large labor market of Mexico City. So you may have to have a Haussmann operation here. And again, you will have to do it not by cutting a street, but probably also relocating people on site by doing a real estate operation at the same time, not concentrate on the street, so that people are relocated on site. And that will be part of the cost of the street in a way, but you will create wealth at the same time. You will create fixed capital. So that's so it's a bit complicated. I'd rather discuss that maybe on a drawing or on a map. But that I think the linkage of poor area with the rest of the labor market by fast transport is very, very important. Very poor people who cannot afford transport very often are limited to taking job relatively close to where they live, and then their salary are much lower because of that, and they have much less also possibility. You learn a lot on the job, and they have less possibility of learning on the job. So I think that this access to the rest of the labor market is very important. Now, on the other question, environmentally sensitive area. Now, there are two possibilities. Either it's area which will always be flooded or are necessarily because of... Again, if people settle there, certainly it's not because they enjoy spoiling the environment. They are because it's only cheap land. So can you provide somewhere land which is as cheap and as well located? The question is that. If you don't, you expel the people from this area, but you have not solved any problem. You have solved, the area looks better without the slum on it, and maybe ducks would be there or something. Would be very nice. But what about those people? Those people will be worse off. So you have absolutely to find an alternative solution. Don't forget that if they go there, it's not because they are ignorant or anything. It's because they look around the entire city and they find this. Although maybe they are flooded all the time, maybe they are full of mosquitoes and things like that, not very comfortable. But they found that from their point of view, this is the best place in the city. So can you find for people like that with this income something which is equivalent and which is not in a sensitive area? So that's the thing. Now, in some area, I remember a case in India where there was a large slum on an area which was regularly flooded. And again, the people knew it was flooded, but because it was flooded, the land was cheap, and that's why they settled there. And it was relatively close. They have a good access to the city center through this area. So the city first decided to remove them and put them somewhere far away from the city where, in fact, they were relatively close. And then we found, if you had a good engineer, we found that by building a bund around this area, in fact, it would be much cheaper to prevent this area from flooding without relocating people and bringing, clean water and a system to remove garbage in this area and things like that. So that was also done quite a number of time in Indonesia, in the Kampung project that I speak about. So again, here you should have a dual, see if the, let's say, some civil work will not solve the problem of flooding, for instance. If the area is not otherwise sensitive. But some area, should stay wet, say wetland or thing like that. That I have no problem with that, obviously. Or say the slope of the volcano around Mexico City probably should not be built because of the difficulty, the drainage problem, that it causes and things like that. So here you have to, but always think, the problem sometimes when you address this is to beautify the area and kick the people out. And these people are not going to disappear. They are not going to go back to their village. They are going to go somewhere else in the city and create another problem. So unless you address the problem of the people and in particular affordability, land affordability and access to job, you are not going to solve the problem.
Amazing answer. Thank you, Alain. I think we have a couple of last other questions. So, and Andrea says that there is a 2004 paper in which you explain that the city of Bangalore restricted FAR in central areas because they believed it would be too costly to build infrastructure large enough to accommodate a large population. And of course, this caused the population to spread outward, which increased demand for infrastructure. Do you know of any cities where this density restriction because of financial concerns would make sense? Because and he believes that many people in Brazil argue against density, saying that the cost of improving infrastructure would be too high.
Look, it's very simple. Look at the cost of land and look at the cost of infrastructure. And very often to save, say, $10 million in infrastructure, you blow up $100 million of real estate. If you so. There could be a situation where infrastructure in some area is so expensive because, I don't know, mud maybe or earthquake or something. But my experience is always that infrastructure is, when there is demand, by the way. The problem is that sometimes planners build infrastructure in the middle of nowhere where there is no demand. Then the infrastructure becomes indeed very expensive because there is no demand for it. But say, if you are in a downtown area and or say suburban area where there is a lot of demand for housing or whatever, or office building, my experience is that it's always cheaper to bring pipes there or to increase the sewer system, things like that. Don't forget, look at cities like Manhattan or Paris, or they had no infrastructure. The infrastructure was built little by little. If Manhattan had decided, in the 19th century, there was no sewer, by the way. We don't want to spend on infrastructure. The city should expand, or you should move to Baltimore or something like that. It doesn't make sense. You have to adapt. The problem, of course, is that very often you do not have mechanism to recover the cost of infrastructure. So you have a municipal budget for sewers, and you have no mechanism to get it back. And it's possible that if you increase density, you have you have something like an impact fee or something which will pay for the additional infrastructure, or you have the system that you have in Texas where you have bonds, which are repaid by property tax in the long run. But here you need a relatively sophisticated financial system, of course, and to do that. So I think it's not that infrastructure is too costly when there is demand for higher. It's just that you have no mechanism to recover the cost of infrastructure. It comes from one pocket and where the money is going in another pocket, and so you don't do it. But I cannot imagine a case where there is a high demand for infrastructure, where the price of real estate will not largely compensate the cost of infrastructure.
Alain, your answer was on point, as I think our last question was exactly on this topic. So Arthur asks about Latin American cities with budget constraints and how could infrastructure be provided. You gave us some light on it already. What do you think about selling building rights other financial mechanisms cities could use?
Yes, let's say the problem, of course, when it's a government will sell it again, how to establish a price which would clear the market. Because you could price it in such a way that doesn't clear the market, then nothing happens. But I think that now, if we talk about Brazil, there is a financial system in Brazil which is deep enough to be able to finance cities. Cities, I'm sure cities are able to issue bonds, and most cities, and probably this is the best way to finance. If you have, of course, that means that you have a property tax or some income which will guarantee the bonds, of course, on which the bonds will be based. So again, I'm not really an expert on municipal finance, frankly, but it is true that the financing of infrastructure is a very important thing, and very often cities are broke, where in fact, when you look at the price of real estate in the city, you don't have the feeling that people are broke. After all, if they pay this amount for real estate, there is money circulating there, and there's no doubt that they should pay for infrastructure. So I think that one example, again, I'm not an expert on that, but one example that I found very convincing is what is used in Texas. I think it's called MUD, municipal urban district. And it's a way of issuing bonds which do not necessarily cover a specific, it can go even over several municipalities, but the bond cover the infrastructure. So when you are in a suburban area, you have a district, which is, the district is specific to the infrastructure, which may go across several suburban boundary, and this seems to work very well, and that explains in large part why housing in general in Texas is much cheaper than in other parts of the United States. Is that because of those bonds, you are able to develop enough infrastructure and by the way, they also in a city like Houston, they revise periodically also now the land use, so that they increase sometimes if they feel there is a demand for smaller apartment or smaller lot, they are able to do that.
One of our supporters, Eric, just messaged us saying that municipalities are restricted from issuing bonds in Brazil.
Oh, really? Yes.
Unfortunately,
yes. Because the states do not think that they are able to repay them, right?
Maybe.
Yes.
But,
so maybe there are other mechanisms than bonds. But I think that when cities are able to issue bonds, and they know they will not be bailed out by the state, I think that might be the best. But maybe I'm biased. Again, I'm not an expert on municipal finance.
There is an instrument in Brazil which I find interesting, that cities can specify an urban area, and they sell building rights that will. And with the proceeds, they will invest in that urban area. And the price is not set nominally by City Hall. It's an auction.
Yes.
And these building right titles are sold in the open market. So that's an interesting way to avoid the price definition.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So and I suppose that in those areas, then they establish also standards of urbanization, right? Because because the building rights are based on the private part of the development, obviously. Yes. It's a bit like what Hong Kong used to do. I'm not so sure now that in the last few years, or if they keep doing it, but that's Hong Kong used to do, in the past to develop. And that's why you had suburbs in Hong Kong of very high densities, because that's what people were ready to pay in order to get as close as possible to London, to the center of Hong Kong, and to public transport, because with the density of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong can function only if about 80% of people use public transport. They stay about 500, 600 people per hectare. I mean, you cannot. So that's a solution. I had a case, strangely enough, in Iran. I work in Iran after the revolution. And there was a mayor of Tehran who was desperate for money and to respond again to densities. And he did exactly that. He auctioned the right to build, and he financed infrastructure like that. And the central government was critical of it. But I look at the outcome there when I went there, and I thought it was, it's a little primitive, let's say, but it worked. It produced an enormous amount of floor space, which was obviously affordable because it was all private, and and it was, people are always asking for a compact city. It created a compact city, by itself without having to regulate it or thing like that. And the fact that it was auctioned, if it was set by the government, you will always suspect that there would be an area where there is no demand and they put a very high price. But here it was obviously demand driven. So again, being demand driven is very important.
Yeah, so I'm personally surprised about these mechanisms because with all of the density restrictions, most big cities are sitting on a pile of cash, right?
Yes, exactly.
They could easily finance themselves in many different ways. But,
a guy like Trump, the way he made some of the money was to buy land in New York, in Manhattan, which was zoned for industrial or something like that. There's still industrial land in Manhattan, and there's no, you would be crazy to create an industry in Manhattan. So this land has very little value. It's used usually for storage, and if you know how to change, so you buy it. If you know how to change this, so it has a potential value of hundreds of millions of dollars, but you buy it for $50 million, and you wait. It takes maybe 10 years with a very expensive lawyer to change the zoning. If without, I'm not implying corruption even. Just a process. The borough president. Who is on board. The community, whatever. After 10 years, suddenly it becomes commercial or residential, and you have made a bundle. But it all goes to the developer and to the lawyers, because you have to have very skilled lawyers to do that. But the city was sitting on it and not doing anything with it.
Yeah. Maybe cities have a lot to learn with real estate development.
Why do New York maintain manufacturing in Manhattan, where there is no demand for manufacturing? It's, again, some people believe that manufacturing job could come back to Manhattan, and that you will have, so the union, a number of people believe, well, if we maintain them, then we will have good jobs in manufacturing instead of having only services. So it's a myth. I mean, it will not happen. And it just, transfer money from the city to developers and lawyers.
Yeah.
No, I apologize for the lawyers and the assistants here. I have a great respect for zoning lawyers. But,
that's fine. Alain, we passed away from the time we had scheduled, but it was a great pleasure to talk to you.
Same here. Thank you.
We're done with questions for now, but I don't want to take too much of your time. It's always an honor to connect with you, and we have many big fans of your work here with us. So thank you.
Neste episódio, conversamos com Alain Bertaud. Na descrição desse episódio, você encontra o link para as referências citadas ao longo da conversa. E se você gostou desse conteúdo e é um amante de cidades, seja apoiador do Caos Planejado. Visite caosplanejado.com para conferir centenas de artigos e todo o conteúdo que produzimos, e faça uma doação para apoiar o nosso trabalho, para nos ajudar a levar essa conversa a um número cada vez maior de pessoas. Com doações a partir de R$ 25 por mês, você participa ao vivo das gravações do podcast, tem acesso ao nosso grupo exclusivo no WhatsApp, a nossa biblioteca virtual com centenas de artigos e muitas outras vantagens. A nossa edição de som é feita pelo Cristiano Botafogo. Obrigado por ouvir o podcast Caos Planejado e espero vocês no próximo episódio. Esse episódio é oferecido pela Tlemcen, que promove a economia circular através de ações reais de sustentabilidade, como gestão de resíduos, projetos de logística reversa e transformação de materiais em produtos novos e reciclados. A Tlemcen atua em todo o Brasil com clientes como Havaianas, P&G, Movida e Parque Ibirapuera. Acesse o site tlemcen.com.br e saiba mais.